Some secrets are buried so deep they follow us to our deathbed. Others surface just when we think it's too late to matter. Margaret had been caring for dying patients for 27 years when she met Walter. The 84-year-old man had late-stage cancer and seemed like any other patient. But when Margaret noticed a strange bruise on his back and gently touched it, Walter flinched and whispered a name. Elena. That's when Margaret realized Walter was hiding something big. As she talked with him over the next few days, she discovered this wasn't just about a bruise. Walter had been living under a false identity for decades. His real family thought he died in the war. Now, with time running out, Margaret found herself caught between a man's deepest secret and a family who deserved the truth. What would you do if you discovered your patient had been dead to the world for 50 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Henley had learned to read death like others read weather patterns. At 68, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that had comforted thousands in their final days, she moved through Willowbrook Hospice with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that dying was as natural as breathing. The morning light filtered through the facility's large windows, casting gentle shadows across the polished floors where she had walked for nearly 3 decades. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the subtle scent of lavender from the aromatherapy diffusers placed throughout the halls. Margaret appreciated how the facility's designers had chosen warm earth tones and soft lighting to create an atmosphere of peace rather than clinical sterility. This wasn't a place where people came to fight death. It was where they came to find dignity in its approach. "Morning, Margaret," called Rosa Martinez, a young aide whose enthusiasm still burned bright after 5 years. Rosa pushed a medication cart down the hallway, her scrubs decorated with tiny sunflowers that seemed to brighten every room she entered. "Good morning, dear. How was your weekend with the grandchildren?" Rosa's face lit up. "Exhausting but wonderful. Little Sophia is walking now, into everything she shouldn't be." She paused at the nurse's station, checking her list. "We have a new admission in room 12. Came in Friday evening while you were off." Margaret nodded, accepting the patient file Rosa handed her. The manila folder felt substantial in her hands, weighted with the details of another life approaching its end. She had reviewed hundreds of these files over the years, each one a story of hopes, struggles, and the inevitable surrender that brought people to her care. "Walter Gibson," she read, aloud, scanning the intake information. 84 years old, metastatic pancreatic cancer, stage 4, no immediate family listed. The phrase, "no immediate family," always tugged at Margaret's heart. She had been blessed with her daughter Susan and 2 grandchildren, though they lived across the country now. The thought of facing death alone seemed particularly cruel, though she had witnessed it more times than she cared to count. Dr. Patricia Chen approached the station, her white coat crisp despite the early hour. Patricia had joined Willowbrook 5 years ago, bringing a gentle bedside manner that complemented her medical expertise. At 42, she was young enough to still feel the weight of each patient's passing, but experienced enough to provide the kind of compassionate care that made the facility special. "You're reading about Walter," Dr. Chen observed, settling beside Margaret with her own cup of coffee. "Interesting case. He's been very quiet since admission, polite but withdrawn. Something about him seems different." Margaret finished, noting the hesitation in the doctor's voice. "Exactly. I can't put my finger on it. His medical history has some gaps, and he seems uncomfortable with personal questions. Not unusual for our population, but with Walter it feels more deliberate." Margaret's instincts, honed by decades of patient care, began to stir. She had learned to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished ordinary privacy from something deeper. Some patients carried guilt about family relationships or past mistakes. Others harbored secrets they believed would burden their loved ones. But occasionally, She encountered someone whose silence felt heavier, more protective. "Any family contact at all?" she asked. "None." He listed himself as his own emergency contact. Said he outlived everyone who mattered. Dr. Chen shook her head. "But there's something about the way he says it, like he's reciting a line he's practiced." Margaret tucked the file under her arm. "I'll spend some time with him today. Sometimes. It takes a while for people to feel safe enough to share." The walk to room 12 took her past the facility's common areas, where early rising residents had begun their morning routines. Mrs. Patterson sat in her wheelchair by the large window, watching cardinals at the bird feeder outside. Her husband visited every day at 2 o'clock sharp, reading to her from romance novels that had sustained their 60-year marriage. In the corner, Mr. Davidson worked on a crossword puzzle, his morning ritual since his admission 6 months ago. These small acts of normalcy provided comfort in a place where normalcy was often disrupted by the progression of illness. Margaret paused outside room 12, taking a moment to center herself. Each new patient represented a sacred trust, the privilege of walking alongside someone during their most vulnerable time. She knocked gently and pushed open the door. Walter Gibson sat propped against pillows, staring out the window at the courtyard beyond. The morning sun highlighted the sharp angles of his face, carved lean by illness and age. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his obvious frailty, he maintained a posture that suggested dignity and self-possession. Something about his bearing reminded Margaret of her own father, a quiet man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Gibson. I'm Margaret Henley, your nurse for the day shift." Walter turned toward her, and she was struck by the clarity in his pale blue eyes. Many patients at this stage showed the cloudiness of pain medication or the distant look of those already beginning their journey away from this world. But Walter's gaze was sharp, assessing. "Nurse Henley," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place, "thank you for your care." The formality of his speech struck her as old-fashioned, courteous, in a way that reminded her of men from her father's generation. She moved around the room, checking his water pitcher and adjusting the blinds to reduce glare on his bedside table. "How are you feeling this morning? Any pain I should know about?" "Some discomfort, but nothing unbearable." He watched her efficient movements with interest. "You've been doing this work a long time." It wasn't a question, and Margaret smiled at his perceptiveness. 27 years next month. You learn to read people in this job. What they need, how they're feeling, sometimes what they're not saying. Something flickered across Walter's face at her last words, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But Margaret's instincts were rarely wrong. This man was indeed carrying something heavy. "Would you like me to help you with breakfast? Or do you prefer to manage on your own?" "I can manage, thank you. Independence has always been important to me." She noted his use of present tense rather than past, as if independence remained a current concern rather than a fading capability. Most patients in Walter's condition had begun the psychological work of letting go, accepting dependence as part of their journey, but Walter seemed to be holding on to something that required self-reliance. "That's understandable," she said, pulling up the visitor's chair. "Mind if I sit for a moment? I like to get to know my patients." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the careful evaluation of someone accustomed to protecting information. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you're comfortable sharing. Some patients like to talk about their families, their work, places they've lived. Others prefer to keep things in the present." "The present seems sufficient," he said quietly. "But not unkindly," Margaret nodded, respecting his boundaries while noting the skillful deflection. In her experience, patients who lived entirely in the present were often running from something in their past. She stood to leave, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "I'll be back to check on you later. If you need anything at all, just press your call button. Sometimes people find it easier to talk when they're not feeling well, and I've been told I'm a good listener." Walter's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Nurse Henley. That's very kind." As Margaret walked back down the hallway, she found her thoughts returning to Walter's careful words and guarded manner. Rosa was right. There was something different about him. Not just the usual privacy of someone facing death, but the deliberate concealment of someone who had spent years protecting a secret. She paused at the nurse's station to make notes in his chart, writing her observations in the careful language that would communicate her concerns to the next shift without violating patient confidentiality. But privately, Margaret felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that had served her well over the decades. Walter Gibson had stories to tell, and she suspected they were stories that needed telling. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm of medication rounds, family consultations, and the gentle ministrations that defined hospice. But Margaret found herself checking on Walter more frequently than strictly necessary, drawn by the puzzle he represented and the growing certainty that his isolation wasn't entirely by choice. Some secrets, she had learned, were burdens that people carried alone until someone showed them it was safe to set them down. Margaret suspected that Walter had been carrying his burden for a very long time, and that whatever it was might be heavier than any one person should bear alone. 3 days later, Margaret was organizing Walter's sparse belongings when she found it, a photograph tucked between the pages of a worn leather Bible that looked older than the man himself. The image was faded, but clear enough to stop her breath. A young soldier in uniform standing beside a woman in a simple dress, her hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The soldier looked remarkably like Walter might have 70 years ago. Same sharp jawline, same intelligent eyes, same careful posture that suggested both strength and gentleness. But according to Walter's intake file, he had never been married and had no children. The date stamped on the back of the photograph read August 1943, which would have made Walter barely 14 years old at the time. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she held the photograph. In 27 years of hospice work, she had learned that family photos were among the most precious possessions people brought with them in their final days. Yet Walter had hidden this one, tucked it away like a secret too dangerous to display. The door to his room opened, and Walter shuffled back from his walk to the courtyard, leaning heavily on his walker. When his eyes fell on Margaret holding the photograph, his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his already pale face, and for a moment she thought he might collapse. "Where did you find that?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an urgency that made Margaret's heart race. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gibson. I was just trying to organize your things, and it fell out of your Bible. I didn't mean to pry." She moved toward him, concerned by his obvious distress. "Please, sit down. You look like you need to rest." Walter allowed her to guide him to his bed, but his eyes never left the photograph in her hands. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said, his accent more pronounced now in his agitation. "No one should have seen that." Margaret sat in the visitor's chair, still holding the photograph carefully. "Mr. Gibson, Walter, it's just a picture. There's nothing wrong with having memories." "You don't understand." He reached out with a shaking hand, and she gently placed the photograph in his palm. His fingers closed around it protectively. "This isn't supposed to exist anymore. I thought I had destroyed them all." The phrase sent a chill through Margaret. Why would someone want to destroy all evidence of what was clearly a family? She leaned forward, her voice gentle but persistent. "Who are they, Walter? The woman and the boy?" His eyes filled with tears he fought to contain. "Eleanor," he whispered, touching the woman's face in the photograph. "And little Thomas. My Thomas." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Your family?" Walter nodded, unable to speak. The careful composure he had maintained since his admission cracked, revealing the grief and longing beneath. Margaret had seen this kind of pain before, not the acute sorrow of recent loss, but the deep chronic ache of separation that had festered for decades. "Walter, what happened to them? Where are Elena and Thomas now? He looked up at her, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. They think I'm dead. They've thought I was dead for almost 80 years. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had suspected Walter was hiding something significant, but this revelation was beyond anything she could have imagined. A man who had been presumed dead for 8 decades, living under what must be an assumed identity, carrying the weight of a lost family in complete isolation. "How is that possible?" she asked softly. Walter's hands shook as he traced the edges. "Of the photograph. The war," he said simply. "Everything changed during the war." Margaret waited, understanding that some stories needed to be drawn out slowly, like water from a deep well. Walter stared at the photograph for a long moment before continuing. "I was supposed to report for duty in September 1943. Elena and I had just been married 6 months. Thomas, he wasn't even my son then, but I loved him like he was. Elena was widowed young, and when we married, I became his father in every way that mattered." He paused, lost in memories that were clearly both precious and painful. Margaret remained quiet, sensing that any interruption might cause him to retreat back into his protective silence. "There were complications," Walter continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Things I can't explain even now. Dangerous things. I had to choose between reporting for duty and protecting my family. I chose them, but in doing so, I had to disappear completely." "You mean you deserted?" Walter flinched at the word. "I prefer to think I chose love over duty, but yes, in the eyes of the military, I was a deserter, a coward who ran when his country needed him." Margaret felt her heart breaking for this man who had carried such a burden for so many years. "And Elena and Thomas?" "I told them I was dead, made it look like an accident, left evidence that would convince the authorities. It was the only way to keep them safe from the people who were looking for me." The story was incredible, yet Margaret found herself believing every word. The pain in Walter's voice was too raw to be fabricated, and the careful way he had constructed his current identity suddenly made perfect sense. "You've been living under a false name all this time?" Walter nodded. "Walter Gibson died in a factory. Hire in Chicago in 1944. I became him because no one would miss a man with no family, no connections. It seemed like a fair trade, a dead man's identity for a living man's peace." Margaret studied the photograph again, noting the joy in Elena's eyes and the way young Thomas leaned trustingly against Walter's leg. "You gave up everything. Name your family your entire life, to protect them, and I would do it again," Walter said firmly. "Even knowing how it would end, alone in a hospice with strangers caring for me, I would make the same choice. Their safety was worth any sacrifice." The room fell quiet, except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of the facility's daily routine. Margaret found herself grappling with the magnitude of Walter's sacrifice and the profound loneliness he must have endured. "Walter," she said gently, "Elena and Thomas, they're probably still alive. Thomas would be in his 70s now. Have you ever thought about—" "No!" The word came out sharp and final. "They grieved for me once. They moved on with their lives. Elena probably remarried, had other children. Thomas grew up without the burden of having a deserter for a father. I won't disrupt their peace now, not when I have so little time left." Margaret wanted to argue, to point out that a family might want to know their loved one was alive, might want the chance to say goodbye. But she could see the fear beneath Walter's resolve. Not fear for himself, but fear that his reappearance might somehow hurt the people he had spent a lifetime protecting. "The bruise on your back," she said suddenly, remembering his reaction when she had first touched it. "It's not from your illness, is it?" Walter's hand moved instinctively to his shoulder blade. "An old wound, a reminder of why I had to disappear. Some scars never fully heal, but they serve their purpose by helping you remember what's important." Margaret felt tears prick her own eyes. Here was a man who had endured 8 decades of solitude, carrying the weight of a decision that had saved his family, but cost him everything he held dear. The photograph in his hands represented not just memories, but a life he had chosen to abandon out of love. As she watched Walter carefully tuck the photograph back into his Bible, Margaret made a decision that would change both their lives. Some secrets were too heavy for one person to carry alone, and some sacrifices too great to honor with continued silence. Walter might have given up his right to his family, but Margaret wasn't convinced his family had given up their right to him. The truth had a way of surfacing when it was most needed, and Margaret suspected that Walter's time was running short, not just for his life, but for the reconciliation he had convinced himself was impossible. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment 3 miles from Willowbrook, staring at the ceiling and replaying Walter's revelation. The image of that young family, Elena's trusting smile, little Thomas leaning against his stepfather's leg, Walter himself looking so young and hopeful, haunted her thoughts. By morning, she had made a decision that went against every protocol she had learned in nearly 3 decades of nursing. She was going to help Walter, whether he wanted her help or not. Her first stop was Walter's room for the routine morning assessment. He was awake, sitting by the window with his Bible open on his lap, but Margaret noticed he wasn't reading. His fingers traced patterns on the worn leather cover, and she suspected the photograph was tucked safely inside. "Good morning, Walter. How did you sleep?" "As well as can be expected." His voice was guarded again, the vulnerability of yesterday carefully contained. "I hope you'll respect what I shared with you yesterday. It wasn't meant for anyone else." "No." Margaret pulled up her chair, settling in for what she sensed would be a delicate conversation. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about Elena and Thomas." Walter's body tensed. "There's nothing to think about. The past is the past." "Is it, though?" Margaret opened Walter's file, pretending to review his medications while actually studying his intake information with fresh eyes. "Walter, I need to check some details in your records. You listed your birthplace as Chicago, Illinois." "That's correct." "And your previous address was in Minneapolis?" "Yes," Margaret nodded, making notes that had nothing to do with his medical care. "What about before Minneapolis? Where did you live before that?" She watched Walter's face carefully. He was intelligent, enough to recognize her probing, and conflicted enough about his deception to show discomfort. "I moved around quite a bit," he said finally. "Never stayed in one place too long. For 80 years. Margaret kept her voice gentle but persistent. "That's a long time to be rootless, Walter. Most people eventually want to settle down, make connections." Walter closed his Bible and held it protectively against his chest. "Not everyone has that luxury, Nurse Henley." Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notepad where she had jotted down some research she'd done the night before on her computer. "I was curious about something. You mentioned that Walter Gibson died in a factory fire in Chicago in 1944. The color drained from Walter's face. "What are you doing?" "My job," Margaret said firmly, "which is caring for my patients' well-being, all of their well-being, not just their physical comfort." She consulted her notes. "There was indeed a Walter Gibson who died in an industrial accident in Chicago in February 1944. He was 23 years old, unmarried, no surviving family. The perfect identity for someone who needed to disappear." Walter's hands shook as he gripped his Bible. "Please stop." "But here's what's interesting," Margaret continued, her voice growing gentler as she saw his distress. "I also found records of a William Kowalski who was reported missing from a small town in Wisconsin in late 1943. He was 24, recently married to Elena Kowalski, stepfather to her 5-year-old son, Thomas." The Bible slipped from Walter's hands and fell to the floor. Margaret bent to retrieve it, and as she did, she felt something hard sewn into the spine. Her fingers found a small, rigid object hidden within the binding. "Walter," she said softly, "what else are you hiding?" His eyes were bright with tears now, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Margaret quickly checked his pulse, elevated but not dangerously so. This wasn't a medical emergency, but an emotional one. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't tell you. It's been too long, too many lies." Margaret moved her chair closer and took his trembling hands in hers. "Listen to me, Walter, or should I call you William? You've been carrying this alone for 8 decades. That's long enough. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you think is so terrible that it justifies this lifetime of isolation, I promise you, it's not worth dying alone." Walter, William, looked into her eyes with the desperation of a drowning man seeing a lifeline. "You don't understand what I did, what I was involved in. Then help me understand." For a long moment, the only sounds in the room were the quiet hum of medical equipment and Walter's labored breathing. Margaret waited, recognizing the moment when years of carefully constructed walls were about to crumble. "There were people," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "during the war. People who needed help getting out of Europe. Jews, mostly, but others too. Resistance fighters, political refugees. There was a network. People who helped them disappear, get new identities, start over in America." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't the story of a coward or deserter she had been expecting. "You were part of this network?" Walter nodded slowly. "My job was supposed to be simple. Create false documentation, help people blend into their new lives. But something went wrong. Someone found out about our operation, and they started hunting us down. One by one, people in the network were disappearing. Not the people we were helping, but the helpers themselves. So you had to disappear too." "I had to choose," Walter said, his voice growing stronger with the telling. "I could report for military duty and hope the authorities could protect Elena and Thomas, or I could disappear completely and take the threat with me. If I was dead, no one would have any reason to hurt my family." Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "The bruise on your back, that's from when they found you?" Walter's hand moved to his shoulder blade. 3 days before I was supposed to report for duty. They cornered me coming home from work. The message was clear: stop what I was doing, or Elena and Thomas would pay the price. So you made yourself disappear that very night. I set up the accident scene, left evidence of my death, and walked away from everything I loved. Walter's voice cracked. "I've spent 80 years wondering if I made the right choice, if there might have been another way." Margaret squeezed his hands. "You saved your family, Walter. You gave up everything to keep them safe. That's not the action of a coward. That's the action of a hero." Walter shook his head. "Heroes don't abandon their families. Heroes don't spend their lives lying about who they are. Heroes make impossible choices and live with the consequences," Margaret said firmly. "And sometimes heroes carry their burdens alone. For so long they forget that the threat has passed, that the people they protected might want to know their sacrifice was worth it." She bent down and picked up the Bible that had fallen earlier, her fingers once again finding the hard object sewn into the spine. "Walter, what's hidden in here?" He looked at the Bible in her hands, then back at her face. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling, and Margaret could see both terror and relief in his expression. "My dog tags," he whispered. "My real dog tags. William Kowalski, U.S. Army. I kept them as a reminder of who I really was, in case I ever forgot." Margaret felt tears in her own eyes as she understood the full magnitude of his sacrifice. For 80 years, this man had carried his true identity hidden in the pages of his Bible, a secret reminder of the life and name he had given up for love. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work to find Walter. She was still adjusting to thinking of him as William, sitting up in bed with more color in his cheeks than she had seen since his admission. The act of sharing his secret, it seemed, had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. "You look better today," she observed, checking his vital signs. "I slept through the night for the first time in months," he admitted. "Strange how telling the truth can be more restful than carrying lies." Margaret smiled, but her expression grew serious as she pulled out her chair. William, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I'll respect it. He studied her face carefully. What is it? Last night I did some more research. I found records of Elena Kowalski in Wisconsin. She lived in a town called Cedar Falls. William's breath caught. Lived? Margaret's heart ached at having to deliver difficult news. She passed away in 1987, William. I'm sorry. The Bible slipped from William's hands as he absorbed this information. Margaret watched decades of hope drain from his face, replaced by a grief so profound it seemed to age him before her eyes. 38 years ago, he whispered. She's been gone for 38 years, and I never knew. Margaret moved closer, taking his hand in hers. But William, there's something else. Something you need to know. He looked up at her, his eyes red with unshed tears. She never remarried, Margaret said gently. The obituary listed her as the widow of William Kowalski, presumed killed in action, 1943. She kept your name, William. For 44 years after you disappeared, she kept your name. William's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he gripped Margaret's hand. She waited for me? More than that. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found this archived with her obituary, a letter to the editor she wrote for the local newspaper in 1983 on what would have been your 40th wedding anniversary. With trembling hands, William unfolded the paper. Margaret watched his face as he read Elena's words, written 4 decades after his disappearance. My husband William was taken from us during the war, but his love has sustained our family every day since. Though his body never came home, his spirit lives on in our son Thomas, who has grown into the kind of man his stepfather would be proud of. William taught us that love means sacrifice, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. I know in my heart that wherever he is at peace, knowing we are safe and happy. Some people are blessed to have love for a season. I was blessed to have a love that transcends time and death itself. William's hands shook so violently he could barely hold the paper. She knew, he gasped. Somehow, she knew I did it for them. Margaret felt tears on her own cheeks. She loved you until the day she died, William. And according to the obituary, so did your son, Thomas. Thomas Kowalski, he became a teacher, married a woman named Ruth, had 3 children of his own. The obituary mentions he was a veteran, served in Vietnam, and later became a high school principal. It says he always spoke proudly of his stepfather, who died serving his country. William buried his face in his hands, overcome by the weight of Elena's enduring love and the life Thomas had built despite, or perhaps because of, his sacrifice. Margaret sat quietly beside him, understanding that some grief needed to run its course before healing could begin. He thinks I was a hero, William finally said, his voice muffled by his hands. Elena told him I was a hero because you were. Margaret said firmly, you are. William looked up at her, his face streaked with tears but somehow lighter than it had been moments before. What about now? Is he still alive? Margaret hesitated. This was the moment that would either offer William a second chance or compound his grief. Yes, she said carefully. He's 79 years old and lives about an hour from here. He's in a retirement community in Pine Ridge. The information hit William like a physical blow. His son, the little boy who had leaned against his leg, in that precious photograph, was alive and living nearby. For a moment, hope blazed in his eyes, followed quickly by fear. No, he said, shaking his head. No, I can't. It's been too long. He's built a life, has his own family. I can't disrupt that now. William, you don't understand, he interrupted, his voice growing agitated. I'm dying. What kind of cruelty would it be to reveal myself now, only to leave him again? To make him watch me die? Margaret chose her words carefully. What kind of cruelty is it to let him continue believing his father was a hero who died in service to his country, when he could learn that his father was actually a hero who lived in service to his family? William stared at her, the logic of her words warring with 8 decades of protective instincts. Besides, Margaret continued gently, don't you think Thomas has the right to make that choice for himself? You decided what was best for your family 80 years ago, and maybe it was the right decision then. But things are different now. The war is over. The people who threatened you are long dead, and your son is a grown man who can handle the truth. But what if... William started, then stopped, seeming to deflate. What if he hates me for abandoning them? What if Elena's love wasn't enough to overcome the hurt of losing a father? Margaret reached into her pocket again and pulled out another. A piece of paper, a printout of an article from the Pine Ridge Community Newsletter. This was published last month, she said, handing it to William. An interview with new residents. William read the headline, Local Veteran Honors Father's Memory Through Community Service. The article featured a photo of an elderly man with familiar eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a memorial garden. Thomas has spent his retirement years volunteering with veteran services, Margaret explained. The article mentions how he was inspired by his stepfather's sacrifice and wanted to honor other families who lost loved ones in war. He may be 79, William, but he's still that little boy who looked up to his father. William stared at the photograph of his son, this stranger who carried his name and his love in equal measure. He looks like Elena, he whispered. He looks like you too, Margaret observed. Same eyes, same bearing. I think he would recognize something in you, even after all these years. The room fell silent except for the sound of William's labored breathing and the distant murmur of activity in the hallway. Margaret could practically see the war being fought in his heart, decades of protective isolation, battling against the desperate desire for connection with his son. Finally, William looked up at her with eyes that held both terror and hope. If I were to see him just once, how would I even begin to explain? Margaret spent her lunch break in the hospice laundry room, carefully examining William's belongings for any other hidden mementos. His old coat, worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs, felt heavier than it should. Her fingers traced the lining, feeling for the irregularities that might indicate concealed objects. Near the left breast pocket, she found what she was looking for, a small, hard lump sewn carefully into the fabric. Using a seam ripper from the facility's sewing kit, she carefully opened the stitching and extracted a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was a simple gold wedding band, tarnished with age but still intact. Engraved on the inside in delicate script were the words WK and EM, forever, June 15th, 1943. Margaret's breath caught. William had carried Eleanor's wedding ring, or perhaps his own, hidden in his coat for 80 years. She imagined him sewing it carefully into the lining, ensuring it would stay close to his heart, even as he built a new identity around himself. When she returned to William's room, she found him staring out the window at the courtyard where other patients sat with their families. His expression was wistful, and she wondered how many times over the decades he had watched other people's reunions while believing his own family was lost to him forever. William, she said softly, closing the door behind her, I found something else. He turned, and when he saw the ring in her palm, his entire body began to tremble. How did you... Your coat, Margaret explained, sitting beside his bed. It was sewn into the lining. William reached out with a shaking hand and took the ring. His fingers traced the familiar contours, and Margaret could see decades of longing in the way he held it. It was Elena's, he whispered. I gave it to her 3 days before our wedding, when I got my first paycheck from the factory. It wasn't much, just a simple gold band. But she cried when I slipped it on her finger. Why do you have it, William? Wouldn't she have been wearing it when... She tried to give it back to me the night I told her I had to leave. William's voice broke slightly. She said I would need something to remember her by, but I made her keep it. I told her it belonged on her finger, that no matter what happened, she would always be my wife. Margaret felt confusion creep into her understanding. Then how? William smiled through his tears. the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "I had 2 rings made, you see, one for her, one for me. Mine was identical, just a size larger. I never told her about it, wanted to surprise her on our first anniversary." He held the ring up to catch the afternoon light. "I never got the chance." The simple gold band seemed to hold the weight of a lifetime's worth of love and regret. Margaret found herself thinking about her own marriage. 32 years with Robert before cancer took him. She still wore her wedding ring, even 5 years after his death, unable to imagine her finger without it. "Have you worn it all these years?" she asked. William shook his head. "I couldn't risk it. Wedding rings make people ask questions about wives, about families. It was safer to keep it hidden." He slipped the ring onto his finger, and Margaret was struck by how right it looked there, as if it had been waiting 80 years to return home. "But you kept it close." "Every day," William confirmed. "Some nights, when the loneliness was unbearable, I would take it out and remember what it felt like to be loved completely by someone. Elena had this way of looking at me like I was exactly who she had been waiting for her whole life." Margaret pulled out her tablet and showed William the genealogy research she had been conducting during her break. "I found more information about Thomas's family. He has 3 children, your grandchildren. Sarah is 52, teaches elementary school like her father did. Michael is 49, works as a carpenter. And Jennifer is 45, she's a nurse." William stared at the screen, absorbing photos and information about the family he had never known existed. "They're beautiful," he said softly. "They have Elena's eyes. Sarah has 4 children of her own, Michael has 2, and Jennifer has 3. That makes you a great-grandfather 9 times over, William." The magnitude of the family he had missed. Births, weddings, graduations, all the moments that make up a lifetime, seemed to overwhelm him. "I've been so selfish," he said quietly. "Selfish." Margaret was startled by his self-accusation. "All these years, I convinced myself I was protecting them by staying away. But maybe I was just protecting myself from the possibility of rejection." William twisted the ring on his finger. "Maybe I was afraid that if I reached out and they didn't want me, it would prove that all my sacrifice was meaningless." Margaret reached for his hand. "Or maybe you were doing exactly what any loving parent would do, putting your child's well-being above your own desires, even when it cost you everything." "But what about their well-being?" William asked. "What about their right to know their father didn't abandon them by choice? What about Thomas's right to know that someone loved him enough to give up everything for his safety?" The questions hung in the air between them, and Margaret recognized the shift that was happening. William was moving from protective isolation toward the possibility of reconnection. It was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. "There's something else," Margaret said carefully. "I called the Pine Ridge retirement community this morning. I told them I was trying to locate family for a hospice patient. They confirmed that Thomas Kowalski lives there and—" She paused, knowing her next words would either encourage William or send him retreating back into his protective shell. "And what?" "He volunteers in their genealogy program. He helps other residents research their family histories and connect with lost relatives." Margaret watched William's face carefully. The volunteer coordinator mentioned that Thomas talks often about his stepfather who died in the war. She said he spent years trying to find out more about what happened to you, where you served, how you died. William's eyes widened. "He's been looking for me? For decades, apparently. He never stopped believing you were a hero. And he never stopped wanting to know more about the man who gave his life for his country." William stared down at the wedding ring on his finger, then back at the photos of his family on Margaret's tablet. "He's been looking for a dead hero. What will he think when he finds a living coward?" "I think," Margaret said gently, "he'll find something even better. He'll find a father whose love was so complete that he was willing to become a ghost to keep his son safe." 3 days later, Margaret was making her afternoon rounds when she noticed Dr. Chen waiting for her at the nurse's station with a concerned expression. "We need to talk about Walter." "William." Dr. Chen said quietly. His condition is deteriorating, faster than expected. Margaret felt her heart sink. She had grown so focused on the possibility of reuniting William with his family that she had almost forgotten the reality of his terminal diagnosis. "How much time are we talking about?" Margaret asked. "Weeks, maybe a month at most. His latest blood work shows significant decline, and he's been experiencing more pain episodes." Dr. Chen consulted his chart. "I've increased his pain medication. But Margaret, if he's going to make peace with his past, it needs to happen soon." The weight of urgency settled on Margaret's shoulders. She had been moving slowly, respecting William's hesitation and fear, but time was no longer a luxury they could afford. That evening, after her shift ended, Margaret drove to Pine Ridge Retirement Community. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, gathering courage for what she was about to do. William had not given her permission for this visit, but she believed some situations required action beyond permission. The community's main building was warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas and walls decorated with residents' artwork. At the front desk, a cheerful volunteer directed her to the library, where Thomas Kowalski was conducting his weekly genealogy workshop. Margaret found him easily. The resemblance to William was unmistakable, despite 8 decades of separation. Thomas had the same intelligent eyes and dignified bearing, though his hair was snow-white and his movements showed the careful precision of advanced age. He was helping an elderly woman trace her family's immigration from Ireland, his voice patient and encouraging. When the session ended, Margaret approached him. "Mr. Kowalski, my name is Margaret Henley. I'm a hospice nurse, and I was wondering if I could speak with you privately." Thomas's expression grew concerned. "Of course. Is this about one of the residents here?" "No, sir, it's about your family, your father specifically." Thomas's face changed immediately, confusion and sudden alertness replacing his earlier calm. "My father? But my father died in 1943, during the war." Margaret gestured toward 2 chairs in a quiet corner of the library. "Mr. Kowalski, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to believe, but I need you to hear me out." Thomas sat slowly, his hands folded carefully in his lap. Margaret could see both curiosity and wariness in his expression. "Your stepfather, William Kowalski, didn't die in 1943, Margaret began carefully. "He's very much alive, and he's currently in my care at Willowbrook Hospice." The color drained from Thomas's face. "That's impossible." "We had confirmation. What you had was a carefully constructed deception, created by a man who loved his family so much he was willing to disappear completely to protect them." Margaret pulled out the photographs she had brought, copies of the family photo and William's current hospice identification picture. Thomas stared at the images, his hands trembling as he held them. "This man he looks like, but it can't be. It's been 80 years. Your stepfather was involved in helping refugees during World War II, Margaret explained gently. "When the operation was discovered and his family was threatened, he made the decision to fake his own death rather than put you and your mother in danger." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos with the intense focus of someone trying to reconcile an impossible truth with a lifetime of beliefs. "My mother," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "she always said she felt like he was still out there somewhere. Even after we received the notification, even after the memorial service, she would sometimes look out the window like she was waiting for him to come home." Margaret's heart ached for the woman who had waited a lifetime for a reunion that never came. "She loved him very much, didn't she?" "She never remarried," Thomas confirmed. "Said she had already found her one true love, and it wouldn't be fair to ask another man to compete with a ghost." He looked up at Margaret with eyes that were suddenly bright with tears. "Except he wasn't a ghost, was he? He was out there, alive, thinking about us. Every single day," Margaret assured him. "He's carried your mother's picture for 80 years. He has your wedding ring, hers and his own, hidden in his belongings. He never stopped loving you both." Thomas stood abruptly, and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking with the effort to contain his emotions. Why now? Why is he telling me this now? Because he's dying, Mr. Kowalski. He has perhaps a month left. And I think, I hope, that he's finally ready to stop protecting you from the truth. Thomas turned back to her, and Margaret could see the little boy from the photograph in his weathered features. Does he want to see me? He's terrified that you'll hate him for abandoning you. He's convinced himself that you're better off thinking. He died a hero's death than knowing he spent 80 years as a living coward. A coward. Thomas's voice was sharp with incredulous anger. He gave up everything, his name, his family, his entire life, to keep us safe. How could anyone call that cowardice? Margaret smiled through her own tears. That's exactly what I told him. But he's spent 8 decades convincing himself that he failed you both. He needs to hear it from you, Mr. Kowalski. He needs to know that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Thomas sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. All these years I've been researching him, trying to find out where he served, how he died, what kind of man he was. I've spent my whole adult life trying to live up to what I thought was his heroic legacy. And what did you find? Thomas laughed, but it was tinged with sadness. Nothing, no military records, no death certificate, no grave site. It was like William Kowalski simply vanished from existence in 1943. I always thought it was because of the chaos of war, but now you know it was because he wanted to vanish completely. Thomas nodded slowly, processing the implications of everything Margaret had revealed. When can I see him? Whenever you're ready, Margaret said. But Mr. Kowalski, Thomas, you should know that he's quite frail. The years have been hard on him, and his illness is advanced. I don't care if he's dying tomorrow, Thomas said firmly. He's my father, and I've been waiting my entire life to tell him that I understand why he had to leave, and that I'm proud of the choice he made. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Willowbrook to find William's room filled with flowers and an unexpected visitor. Rosa was adjusting his pillows while a distinguished-looking man in military dress uniform sat in the visitor's chair, speaking quietly with William. "Margaret," William called out when he saw her, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I'd like you to meet Colonel James Morrison, retired. He's from the Veterans Administration." Colonel Morrison stood and extended his hand to Margaret. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and the bearing of a career military officer. "Nurse Henley, Mr. Kowalski has been telling me about your role in helping him reconnect with his past." Margaret felt confusion wash over her. "I'm sorry, but how did you—" "I contacted the VA yesterday," William explained, his eyes brighter than she had seen them since his admission. "After our conversations about Thomas, I realized I needed to understand something that has haunted me for 80 years. Colonel Morrison opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "Mr. Kowalski, or Mr. Gibson as he's been known, asked me to research the network he was involved with during World War II. What I found will interest you both." Margaret sank into Rosa's vacated chair, sensing that whatever Colonel Morrison was about to reveal would change everything she thought she knew about William's story. The organization Mr. Kowalski worked with was called the Underground Railroad Revival, Colonel Morrison began. It was a classified operation run jointly by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and British intelligence. Their mission was to extract high-value refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe and relocate them safely in Allied countries. William leaned forward, his attention completely focused on the colonel's words. "Mr. Kowalski, you weren't part of some informal civilian network. You were working for the United States government in an official capacity, though your role was so classified that even you weren't told the full scope of the operation." Margaret felt her breath catch. "What are you saying?" Colonel Morrison pulled out a photograph, an official military portrait of a young man in uniform. The face was unmistakably William, though he looked impossibly young. William Kowalski was recruited for Operation Phoenix in early 1943 because of his language skills and his work with refugee communities in Wisconsin. His cover story was that he was a factory worker awaiting military conscription, but in reality, he had already been sworn in as a covert operative. William stared at the photograph, his hands trembling. "But I never took an oath. I never went through basic training. I was just helping people." "Your oath was administered by a representative from the OSS in February 1943, Colonel Morrison continued, consulting his documents. "The ceremony was conducted in secret, with only 2 witnesses present. Your military service began immediately, though your mission required you to maintain your civilian cover." Margaret watched William's face as decades of self-recrimination began to crumble. "You mean he wasn't a deserter?" "Quite the opposite," Colonel Morrison said firmly. When the network was compromised in September 1943, Mr. Kowalski was ordered to implement Protocol 7. Complete identity elimination to protect both the remaining operatives and his own family. "Protocol 7, William whispered. "The order. To disappear completely. Your commanding officer determined that the threat to your family was credible and immediate. Faking your death wasn't abandonment, Mr. Kowalski. It was following direct orders from the United States Army." The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of William's labored breathing. Margaret could see him struggling to process information that reframed his entire understanding of his past. The people who threatened my family were Nazi sympathizers who had infiltrated several refugee assistance networks, Colonel Morrison explained. The FBI was closing in on them, but not quickly enough to guarantee your family's safety. Your disappearance drew their attention away from other operatives and allowed the Bureau to complete their arrests without further casualties. William buried his face in his hands. "I thought I was a coward. For 80 years, I believed I had abandoned my duty." "You fulfilled your duty in the most difficult way possible," Colonel Morrison said gently. "You sacrificed everything personal for the success of the mission and the safety of your fellow operatives. The network you helped establish saved over 300 lives during the war." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched William grapple with this revelation. The man who had spent 8 decades convinced of his own cowardice was learning that he had been a decorated war hero all along. "There's more," Colonel Morrison continued. "Because your mission was classified, your family couldn't be told the truth about your service. But the Army never forgot what you did. You've been carried on active duty roles as missing in action since 1943, with full honors." He handed William another document, a military service record showing commendations, medals, and a distinguished service citation. "You were promoted to Staff Sergeant in 1944, posthumously awarded the Bronze Star in 1945, and recommended for the Silver Star in 1947 when the full scope of Operation Phoenix was declassified for military review." William stared at the documents in disbelief. "But why now? Why are you telling me this now?" Colonel Morrison's expression grew solemn. "Because someone has been looking for you, Mr. Kowalski. Your son Thomas contacted the Veterans Administration 6 months ago. He'd been researching your military service for decades, and when he couldn't find any official records, he filed a formal inquiry." Margaret felt her heart stop. "Thomas was looking for him?" Thomas Kowalski served with distinction in Vietnam and later became involved with veteran services. He never stopped believing his stepfather was a hero, and he never stopped trying. To prove it, Colonel Morrison pulled out one final document, a letter written on official VFW letterhead. "This is a letter Thomas wrote to the VA last year. He wanted to establish a memorial scholarship in your honor, Mr. Kowalski, for children of military families. He'd been fundraising for months, telling anyone who would listen about his stepfather who died serving his country." William took a letter with shaking hands and read aloud. "My stepfather, William Kowalski, taught me that true heroism isn't about glory or recognition. It's about doing what's right, even when no one will ever know. He gave his life for something bigger than himself, and I want to honor that sacrifice by helping other military families." The letter continued, but William's voice broke as he read Thomas's words about the man who had shaped his understanding of duty, honor, and sacrifice. "He's been honoring you publicly for years," Margaret whispered, "even while you were hiding. In shame, your son was telling the world that you were a hero." Colonel Morrison stood and came to attention beside William's bed. "Staff Sergeant William Kowalski, on behalf of the United States Army and the Veterans Administration, it is my honor to present you with the medals you earned in service to your country." He opened a presentation case containing the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and several other commendations. "Your service has been exemplary, your sacrifice extraordinary, and your honor intact." As Colonel Morrison pinned the medals to William's hospital gown, Margaret watched 80 years of guilt and self-doubt finally lift from his shoulders. The man who had believed himself a coward was finally learning the truth. He had been a hero all along. After Colonel Morrison left, William sat in stunned silence, fingering the Bronze Star pinned to his hospital gown. Margaret had never seen such a transformation in a patient. The shame and guilt that had defined him for 8 decades was gradually being replaced by something she hadn't expected to see: pride. "I need to tell you something," William said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "There's one more thing I've been hiding." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. After all the revelations of the past few days, she wasn't sure her heart could handle another surprise. William reached beneath his pillow and withdrew a small wooden object, carved with obvious care and worn smooth by decades of handling. It was a toy soldier, no bigger than Margaret's thumb, with intricate details that spoke of countless hours of patient work. "I made this for Thomas," William said, cradling the tiny figure in his palm. "For his 5th birthday, just 3 days before I had to disappear. I was going to give it to him that morning, but..." His voice broke, and Margaret felt tears prick her own eyes as she understood the significance of this small treasure. "I've carried it with me for 80 years, William continued. "Some nights, when the loneliness was unbearable, I would take it out and remember what it felt like to be someone's father, even if only for a few months." Margaret examined the tiny soldier more closely. Despite its age, she could see the love that had gone into every detail. The carefully carved uniform, the proud stance, the gentle expression on the miniature face. "It was going to be the first of a whole army," William explained. "I planned to carve him a different soldier for every birthday. Cowboys, knights, maybe even a general when he got older. I wanted to give him adventures, help his imagination grow." "You can still give it to him," Margaret said softly. William shook his head. "He's 79 years old, Margaret. What use does he have for a child's toy?" "The same use you've had for it all these years," she replied. "It's not about the toy, William. It's about the love behind it." That afternoon, Margaret made the call she had been both anticipating and dreading. Thomas Kowalski answered on the second ring, his voice eager and anxious. "Mr. Kowalski, this is Margaret Henley. Are you ready to see your father?" "I've been ready for 80 years, Thomas replied without hesitation. "When can I come?" "Tomorrow morning if you're able. But Thomas, I need to prepare you for what you're going to see. Your father is very ill, and he's quite frail. He may not look much like the man in that photograph anymore." "I don't care if he's barely recognizable," Thomas said firmly. "He's my father, and I love him." The simple declaration brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "There's something else. We've learned some things about your father's military service, things that will explain why he had to disappear." "What kind of things?" Margaret briefly explained Colonel Morrison's visit and the revelation about Operation Phoenix. She listened to Thomas's sharp intake of breath as he processed the information. "So, he really was a war hero," Thomas said quietly. "Mother always believed it, but I thought it was just wishful thinking. She used to say she could feel it in her heart, that the man she married couldn't have died anything less than heroically." "Your Father has been carrying tremendous guilt about leaving you both. He's convinced himself he was a coward who abandoned his family. Then I'll have to convince him otherwise, Thomas said with determination that reminded Margaret powerfully of William. What time should I be there? After they arranged the details, Margaret spent the rest of her shift helping William prepare for the reunion he had both yearned for and feared for 8 decades. She helped him shower and shave, noting how the simple act of grooming seemed to restore some of his dignity. When she offered to help him dress in something other than his hospital gown, he surprised her by asking for his old suit, the one piece of formal clothing he had brought with him. I want to look like someone worthy of being Thomas's father, he explained as Margaret helped him with the buttons. His hands were too unsteady now to manage them alone. The suit was old but well-maintained, and Margaret could see that it had once been expensive. As she helped him into the jacket, she realized this must be the suit he had worn for important occasions throughout his years of hiding. Job interviews, perhaps, or the rare social events where Walter Gibson needed to look respectable. You look very handsome, she told him honestly. Despite his illness and advanced age, there was something distinguished about William when he was dressed properly. She could imagine the young man Thomas would remember, and she could also see the father Thomas would be proud to claim. As evening approached, William grew increasingly agitated. He asked Margaret to help him practice what he would say, then changed his mind and decided he should let Thomas speak first. He worried that Thomas would be angry, then convinced himself that Thomas would be disappointed to find his hero was just a sick old man. What if he doesn't forgive me? William asked for the 10th time as Margaret helped him back into bed. Then, you'll deal with that when it happens, Margaret said gently. But William, I've spoken with your son. He's not coming here to judge you. He's coming because he loves you, and he's spent his entire life hoping for this moment. That night, Margaret stayed late, sitting with William as he drifted in and out of restless sleep. Several times he woke with a start, calling out Elena's name or asking if Thomas had arrived yet. The anticipation was taking a toll on his already weakened system, but Margaret could also see something she hadn't seen before: hope. At 3 a.m, William woke fully and looked at Margaret with clear, focused eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For seeing past what I thought I was to who I might really be. For refusing to let me die alone with my secrets." He reached for her hand, with fingers that were steadier than they had been in days. "Elena would have liked you. She always said that the best nurses were the ones who cared for people's hearts as much as their bodies." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "Get some rest, William. Tomorrow is going to be a big day. The biggest day of my life," he corrected. "The day I stop being Walter Gibson and become William Kowalski again." As dawn approached, Margaret helped William with his morning routine, noting that despite his obvious exhaustion, he seemed more alert and present than he had since his admission. It was as if the prospect of reunion was giving him strength he didn't know he still possessed. 8:30, Rosa knocked on the door and peered inside. "Margaret, there's a gentleman here to see Mr. Kowalski. Says he's family." William's entire body tensed, and Margaret saw both terror and anticipation flash across his face. "Are you ready?" she asked. William looked down at the tiny wooden soldier. He held in his palm, then up at Margaret, with eyes that held 80 years of longing. "I've been ready since 1943, he said. "Ask my son to come in." Margaret walked to the door, her heart pounding with the magnitude of the moment she was about to witness. In the hallway stood an elderly man who was unmistakably William's son. The same eyes, the same bearing, the same gentle strength that had sustained him through decades of believing his father was a hero. Thomas Kowalski was holding a manila envelope in hands that shook with anticipation, and when he saw Margaret, his face lit up with a smile that reminded her powerfully of the little boy in the photograph. "Is he really in there?" Thomas whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the dream he had carried for 8 decades. "He's really in there," Margaret confirmed. "And Thomas, He's been waiting for you just as long as you've been waiting for him." Margaret stepped aside as Thomas entered the room, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Father and son looked at each other across 8 decades of separation. Two elderly men who shared the same eyes, the same careful way of holding themselves, the same quiet dignity that no amount of time could erode. "Hello, Thomas," William said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, the manila envelope clutched against his chest like a shield. His eyes traveled from William's face to the military medals pinned to his hospital gown, then back to his father's eyes he had seen in the mirror his entire life. "I thought you were dead," Thomas said, and Margaret heard the echo of the 5-year-old boy he had been in his voice. "I was supposed to be," William replied. "I had to be to keep you safe." Thomas took a tentative step into the room, then another, drawn by a pull stronger than uncertainty or fear. "All these years, I've been trying to find you, trying to learn about the hero who gave his life for his country." William's face crumpled. "I'm not a hero, son. I'm just a man who loved his family too much to let them be hurt because of me." "No," Thomas said firmly, his voice growing stronger. "That's exactly what makes you a hero." He opened the manila envelope with trembling hands and withdrew a stack of papers. Decades worth of research, correspondence with military offices, genealogy charts mapping the Kowalski family history. "Do you know what I found when I searched for William Kowalski, killed in action 1943? Thomas asked, spreading the papers on William's bedside table. "Nothing. No death certificate, no grave registration, no casualty reports. It was like you vanished into thin air." William watched his son's methodical presentation with growing amazement. This was his little Thomas, all grown up, but still approaching problems with the same careful logic he had shown as a child. "But I kept searching," Thomas continued, "because Mother never stopped believing you were out there somewhere. She used to say she could feel you thinking about us, especially on birthdays and holidays." "She was right," William whispered. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I missed, I thought about you both." Thomas pulled out a small, worn photograph and handed it to his father. It was the companion to the one Margaret had found in William's Bible. The same family picture, but this one had been carefully preserved under glass in an ornate frame. "This has been on Mother's dresser, then mine, for 80 years, Thomas explained. "She never put it away, never treated it like a memorial. She kept it there like she was still waiting for you to come home." William took the photograph with shaking hands, comparing it to his own faded copy. "She kept it out in the open, every day of her life. And when she was dying," Thomas's voice broke slightly, "when she was dying, she held this picture and told me to keep looking for you. She said she knew in her heart that someday, somehow, you would find your way back to us." The two men stared at each other across the hospital bed, 44 years of Elena's unwavering faith bridging the gap between them. "I was so afraid," William said, tears flowing freely now. "Afraid you would hate me for leaving. Afraid I had destroyed your childhood, ruined your life." Thomas moved closer to the bed, his own eyes bright with tears. "You didn't ruin my life, Dad. You gave me something to live up to. Every decision I've made, every challenge I've faced, I've asked myself what William Kowalski would do. What the man who loved us so much he disappeared would want me to do." The word Dad hung in the air between them, the first time Thomas had spoken it aloud in 8 decades. William's breathing became labored, and Margaret started to step forward, but he held up a weak hand to stop her. "I have something for you," William said, his voice barely audible. He held out the tiny wooden soldier he had carved so long ago. "I made this for your 5th birthday. I was going to give it to you the morning I had to leave." Thomas stared at the small carving in disbelief, then gently took it from his father's palm. The wood was warm and smooth, polished by decades of William's touch. "You kept it all this time. It was all I had left of being your father," William said. "On the hardest nights, I would hold it and remember what it felt like when you used to fall asleep in my lap while I read you stories." Thomas cradled the soldier in his palm, and Margaret watched as 79 years of wondering about his stepfather crystallized into this perfect, simple proof of love that had transcended time and distance. "I remember those stories," Thomas said softly. "You used to make up adventures about brave soldiers who protected their families. I never forgot them, Dad. I told those same stories to my children." Father and son looked at each other with the recognition that comes not from shared features, but from shared love that had survived impossible circumstances. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that made William's breath catch, a complete, undamaged wedding photograph showing William and Eleanor on their wedding day, June 15th, 1943. She kept this on her nightstand until the day she died, Thomas said, placing it beside William's faded copy. "Every night before bed, she would kiss her fingers and touch your face in the picture. She told me once that she could feel you missing us as much as we missed you." William stared at the pristine photograph, seeing Elena as she had been on the happiest day of their short time together, radiant in her simple white dress, her eyes full of love and hope for their future. "She never remarried?" William asked, though he already knew the answer. "Never even dated," Thomas confirmed. "She said her heart was taken, and that was that. When people asked her why, she would just smile and say that some loves are worth waiting for, even if you have to wait forever." William traced Elena's face in the photograph with a trembling finger. "I hoped she would find someone else, someone who could give her the life she deserved." "She had the life she deserved," Thomas said firmly. "She had a love story that sustained her for 44 years after you left. She raised me to be proud of my father, to understand that sometimes love means making impossible choices. She was happy, Dad, different than she might have been with you there, but genuinely happy." Thomas pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, studying his father's face as if memorizing every line and weathered feature. "Tell me about her," William whispered. "Tell me about the life I missed." Thomas smiled, and for a moment the years fell away, and William could see the boy he had helped raise. "She became a teacher. Said you always encouraged her to pursue her education, so after we thought you died, she went back to school. She taught third grade for 30 years. She always wanted to teach," William remembered. "She used to practice lessons on you when you were little. She was wonderful at it, patient, kind, never gave up on anyone. The children adored her, and their parents too. She had this way of making everyone feel like they mattered." Thomas's voice grew soft with memory. "She retired when I had my first child, your granddaughter Sarah, because she said being a grandmother was more important than any career." "Granddaughter," William repeated wonderfully. "You named her Sarah after Mother's mother, like Elena always planned we would if you had a daughter together." Thomas reached for his wallet and pulled out a collection of family photographs. "Sarah's 52 now. Teaches elementary school just like her grandmother did. These are her children, your great-grandchildren." William's hand shook as he looked at the photographs of children who carried his blood, his legacy, though they had never known his name. "And these," Thomas continued, showing more pictures, "are Michael's children and Jennifer's. 9 great-grandchildren total, Dad. Elena lived to meet the first 6 before she passed." William stared at the faces of his extended family, graduates and brides, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, a lifetime of moments he had missed, but that existed because of the choice he had made to protect Thomas and Eleanor. Did Elena ever talk about forgiving me? William asked, his voice heavy with 8 decades of guilt. Thomas leaned forward and took his father's hands in his own. "Dad, there was nothing to forgive. She understood why you had to go. Maybe not the details. She never knew about the underground network or the government operation, but she knew in her heart that William Kowalski would never abandon his family unless it was the only way to save them." "How could she know that?" "Because she knew you," Thomas said simply. She knew the man who carved toy soldiers for his stepson, who read bedtime stories with different voices for all the characters, who worked double shifts to buy her a wedding ring. She knew that man would die before he would willingly leave his family. William closed his eyes, feeling a weight he had carried for 8 decades, finally beginning to lift. "I was so afraid that you would grow up thinking I was a coward. I grew up thinking you were the bravest man who ever lived," Thomas said firmly. "And now that I know the truth, now that I understand what you really did, I know I was right." Thomas reached into his envelope one final time and withdrew an official-looking document. "This is a copy of the Memorial Scholarship application I filed with the Veterans Administration. I've raised $43,000 in your honor, Dad, for children of military families who've lost parents in service to their country." William read the application through tears, seeing his name, his real name, listed as a war hero who had made the ultimate sacrifice for freedom and family. "You've been honoring me publicly," he whispered in amazement. "For years," Thomas confirmed. "Because you deserve to be honored. Because what you did, giving up everything for love, that's the greatest kind of heroism there is." Father and son sat in comfortable silence, bridging 8 decades with forgiveness, understanding, and a love that had never died. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood at the window of William's room, watching Thomas teach his great-grandchildren about their newly discovered great-grandfather. The children, ranging in age from 8 to 16, sat in a semicircle around William's bed, while Thomas shared the story of the hero who had sacrificed everything for love. William had declined rapidly since the reunion, but Margaret had never seen a patient face death with such peace. The guilt and shame that had defined his final years had been replaced by something precious, the knowledge that his sacrifice had been understood, honored, and passed down through 3 generations of the family he had saved. Great-grandpa. "William?" asked 9-year-old Emma, Thomas's youngest great-grandchild. "Were you scared when you had to pretend to be someone else?" William smiled, his voice weak but clear. "Every single day, sweetheart. But do you know what kept me brave?" "What?" Emma asked, leaning closer. "Knowing that somewhere out there, my family was safe and happy because of what I did, that made everything worth it." Margaret watched the children absorb this lesson in love and sacrifice, understanding that William's story would become part of their family legacy, not the tale of abandonment he had feared, but the story of a grandfather whose love transcended time and circumstance. Thomas had arranged for a photographer to document these precious days, creating a family album that would preserve William's story for generations to come. Margaret found herself included in many of the pictures, having become part of the family through her role in reuniting them. "Nurse Margaret," called Sarah, Thomas's daughter, from across the room. "Dad wants to show you something." Margaret approached the bed where William lay, surrounded by his family. Despite his obvious weakness, his eyes were bright with contentment. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to have this." He pressed a small object into her palm. The Bronze Star Colonel Morrison had pinned to his hospital gown. "William, I can't take this. It belongs to your family." "My family has something better," he replied, looking around at the children and grandchildren who now knew his name and his story. "They have the truth. But you gave me back my identity. You helped me remember who I really was." Thomas nodded his agreement. "Dad's right. Without you, he would have died as Walter Gibson, and we never would have known. You gave us our father back." Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she closed her fingers around the medal. In 30 years of nursing, she had received many thanks from grateful families, but nothing had ever meant as much as this recognition from the man she had helped find his way home. That evening, as visiting hours ended and the family reluctantly had prepared to leave, William asked Margaret to stay with him for a few minutes. "I need to thank you properly," he said when they were alone. "You already have, William. More than enough. No, you don't understand." William's eyes were clearer than they had been in days, as if gathering strength for something important. "Elena came to me in a dream last night." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Patients near death often reported visits from deceased loved ones, and she had learned to listen respectfully to these experiences. "She looked just like she did in our wedding photograph," William continued. "Young and beautiful and happy. She told me she was proud of me, proud of the choice I made, proud of the man Thomas became, proud of the family we built even though we were apart. That's beautiful, William." She also told me something else. William's grip on Margaret's hand tightened slightly. "She said she sent you to me. Said some angels work in hospices, helping people find peace before they cross over." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not an angel, William. I'm just a nurse who cared about her patient." "Same thing," William whispered, with a smile. "Elena said to tell you that she's waiting for me, and that when I see her again, it will be like no time has passed at all. She said true love doesn't count the days, it just treasures them." 3 days later, William passed peacefully in his sleep with Thomas, holding one hand and Margaret holding the other. His final words were Elena's name, spoken with the same love and wonder he had carried for 80 years. The funeral was held at the small church where William and Elena had been married in 1943. The service was attended by more than 200 people, family members, veteran organizations, former students of Elena's, and staff from Willowbrook Hospice who'd been touched by William's story. Thomas spoke about the father who had taught him that love sometimes requires impossible sacrifices, and that heroism isn't always about glory. Sometimes it's about the quiet courage to carry burdens alone so others can live free. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing the bronze star on a chain around her neck, surrounded by the family she had helped reunite. As Thomas shared stories of the grandfather his children would remember, Margaret reflected on the profound privilege of her work, the honor of walking alongside people during their most vulnerable moments, and sometimes, when grace allowed, helping them find their way home. After the service, as the family gathered at the cemetery where William was laid to rest beside Elena's grave, Margaret thought about the lessons of the past month. Love, she realized, was indeed stronger than time, fear, or even death itself. And sometimes, when we think it's too late for second chances, life surprises us with exactly the miracle we need, not just for ourselves, but for all the people whose lives we touch along the way. William Kowalski had spent 80 years believing he was a coward, but his story would be remembered as one of the greatest love stories Margaret had ever witnessed, a testament to the truth that some sacrifices are so profound they become legends, and some loves so deep they last forever.